Yeah, it's pretty scary really to look at the destruction that these drugs have had over the last is it 50 years, maybe a little bit longer than that, and it's been nothing but an upward trend for all those decades. More and more people now are being diagnosed with all types of mental illnesses. I always question why. Why does something happen? Nothing happens by random. There's always a cause for something. And, my question really is, why is this happening? Why are so many people becoming mentally ill and prescribed drugs and, taking them for, I don't know, maybe 10 years, maybe even longer than that. I know people that have taken them for 2 decades minimum, and with no improvement. So, why is this happening, do you reckon, Dr. Josef? What's going on here?
Yeah, such a good question. It's a hard one to answer because there's multiple variables, but maybe if I kind of pick at them one by one, you and I guess the listeners to this may be able to kind of piece this mosaic together and kind of get it. So the first one is the way we decided to diagnose mental illness. And so, way back when, let's start at the turn of the century, the early 1900s when Freud was really popular. The idea of anxiety and depression, they used to call it neurosis, was a really prominent way of his ideas were really prominent. And these were sort of unconscious conflicts that you had to, bring to the surface. Family conflicts. There were things like the Oedipus complex, but it really was a way of looking at mental health as more relational in nature and things like that. And there was actually, there was a lot of really weird stuff about Freud. In some ways, some of the ideas were good, but it really got very fixated on internal conflicts and relational stuff. And don't get me wrong, relational stuff is important, but there's a lot more to mental health than that anyway. So we had that model for a long time, and honestly, no one could really agree on who was sick and who wasn't sick. And there was a big crisis of confidence in how we were kind of saying, oh, this depression is due to this conflict versus that one and such. And to cut a long story short, there were a bunch of embarrassing things that happened in psychiatry, and then they landed on the DSM. And that was a new way of conceptualizing mental illness. And so the DSM redid their diagnostic categories in the 70s, and they made it a list. Essentially, it was like, well, we don't really know why depression happens. Maybe it's biological, maybe it's due to conflicts. And frankly, we don't really care anymore. We're just going to say depression is, 5 out of these 9 symptoms. And at least we're speaking the same language now. And over time, we might get a better sense of which forms are more biological and which forms are more due to intrapsychic conflicts and, things between the id and the ego and whatever. So that's where it was kind of tilted in the 70s, and it's kind of stayed there. Now,
just so I can interrupt quickly there, Dr. Josef, what's interesting that I found when I interviewed Robert Whittaker was that how they landed on those symptoms was not through a thorough scientific method, based on scientific evidence. It was actually a consensus of a group of a consortium of psychiatrists. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's my understanding. And I know that sounds it sounds crazy if you look at it from our perspective going back then, but I think at the time it's like there's a researcher out there and they're like, we really need to understand why people are depressed. Okay, we need some kind of criteria to bring people in, and like at least just we got to grab people in some seemingly objective way to start studying them, and then we're going to look at their genes and we're going to look at their histories and we're going to find patterns. And they go, well, all right, doctors in this room, what do you think are the most common symptoms in your depressed patients? And they go, oh, well, they're fatigued and they're tired and they're anxious and they feel really guilt-ridden. And then they go, okay, well, that's what most people are saying. That seems reasonable. And as a starting point, maybe it is reasonable if you're going to start somewhere and then look for biological underpinnings or patterns in that group. But it never really evolved beyond then, and it kind of took on a life of its own, where nowadays people are like, oh, if you have 5 out of 9 symptoms, you've got a medical condition, you have a clinical diagnosis, there's something really unique about that. But that whole diagnostic criteria was meant to give us, was meant to be a starting point where we would be able to say, okay, this is kind of biological, this depression over here looks like it's totally based on life circumstances, poverty, relational problems. We're getting these different patterns, but over time, and I guess I'll talk about the next variable now, over time, we started to get obsessed with biology and the biological understanding of depression. And that's really where pharma comes into it. So in the late 80s, there's a lot of drug development before then, but this is a real turning point. In the late 80s, Prozac, the first SSRI, gets developed by Eli Lilly, and it enters the market. And this is a drug that you take every day for your mood. And a lot of people have questions about that. They go, well, this seems kind of unusual, take something every day for my mood. Isn't this like, aren't I just, muting my symptoms? Like if I'm upset, if I'm anxious or depressed, shouldn't I be paying attention to that and fixing that? And in response to that, we start getting a lot of language around, well, hey, you actually might have a chemical imbalance. This starts to be a vested interest in describing anxiety and depression as maybe more of a biological process. Let's make Prozac like insulin that people take for diabetes. Let's make it seem like it's this thing that fixes some known underlying process. And so you start getting a lot of this chemical imbalance type language coming out. And that, I think, is really what has kind of gripped the public for the last 30 years.
And that was never proven, right? The chemical imbalance theory was literally that. It was just a theory.
Totally. It was just a theory, just like you said. People noticed that, hey, we had this really lethargic and depressed person, and we gave them a drug which we know modulates neurochemistry, and they appeared to be more energized. And so instead of saying, oh, these drugs have energizing effects, or these drugs have anxiety reducing effects, one other way to spin it was, or maybe their brain was broken and now we've rebalanced them. And so that's where this whole chemical imbalance thing is coming from. It's just like a Just So story, almost to help people rationalize taking the medications. And I want to bring it back to the start, Reese, because you said, why is it these days that like so many people are taking these meds? And that idea from Prozac and all of the other drugs that jumped on the bandwagon has, there's been, I guess, a war chest of marketing money in, educating doctors and making ads in the US and, getting engaged with different academic centers around the world to have their professors do this research. It's had such a huge impact in shaping how we talk about depression and these drugs. And so I think kind of marketing and spin from some of these really powerful companies has shaped that. And that's why I think these days it feels really normal to say, oh, well, depression, go and talk to your doctor about it. But it's like, why? Why is that the knee-jerk reaction? Like, what does your doctor know about the things that are making you depressed? Your doctor that you see in a 15-minute visit, is he going to know? Is he going to be able to talk to you about why you're not satisfied at work? Why, you've got some maladaptive traits that make it hard for you to connect with an intimate other person or your friends? Is your doctor going to be able to do anything about the poverty that you're in? People take that for granted. I'm going to talk to my doctor because I'm depressed. What are they going to do about it? I mean, the things that actually make people unhappy in the most place, they're not things that doctors are trained to do. I mean, the doctor is trained essentially to write a script for something, but not I guess, help people in the way that, honestly, I've come to see as the correct way. And actually, it's the most intuitive way for people to think about fixing people with anxiety and depression, the majority of them. But then I think they get taught out of it because everyone gets told, oh, wait, no, it's a serious medical condition. You know, they got to see the doctor for it. And I mean, that's really the idea that a lot of people have these days. And I think it's very harmful.
Yeah, it's the whole rebranding it as a medical illness, right? And now we've got people, you know, as young as 6, 7, 8 years old, toddlers, believing they have a medical condition and there's something wrong with them. You know, that they're depressed. You know, because I remember my bloody depression at 5 years old. You know, and they're taking hardcore psychiatric drugs at 6 years old. You know, and they go on to, because it doesn't just lead to, you know, just taking one tablet. It develops. You know, this is what I've noticed. It's almost like a bit of what's the word I'm looking for? Like a conveyor belt. You know, they start taking one, and they hit a certain age, and they get a review or whatever, and the doctor says, "Oh, well, actually, you know, you've got this symptom, and you need to take this drug." And before you know it, they've got these collection of different drugs that they're taking, and you know, by the time they hit their teenage years, they're just it's a right mess. It's a right mess, and what you're doing now is so vital. And it just seems that you're part of the minority of people that have come to, you know, they've seen the light almost, or whatever you want to call it, and now you're doing great work to get them off these meds.
I was going to touch on that point and just say, you know, I think about the parents that put their kids on the meds, and these are parents that love their kids, and who have been led astray by the doctors, right? You know, and the truth is that the medical education has failed doctors. Most doctors are good people, but there are some really, I think the academic leaders in a lot of the medical specialties have been highly compromised by their relationship with the pharmaceutical companies. And so I think the academic leaders end up having very pro-drug perspectives on things. They minimize the harms, they amplify the risks because they're engaged and they have a lot of relationships with the drug companies and such. And then it trickles through, it compromises good doctors who are caring people, and then it compromises loving parents who are scared about what's happening with their kids. And because they're not going to go and look at the medical research, how can they? You know, they're going to trust the person in the white coat that's been with them for decades sometimes, and just say, hey, you know, I'm going to do it. So, I mean, there's just this, it's just a total, I mean, like I said, you know, sometimes it's really, you know, like, you know, how could this thing happen? But the most relatable way to explain it to everyone is, yeah, when you have a lot of money that's behind certain ideas and an agenda to sell medications, you can just see how things flow down and influence, and it's really not that hard to understand how things happen when you get that part of it. The other thing I wanted to, you know, you're prompting me to think about all these interesting things, like the kid that takes the med. There's a huge opportunity cost to taking psychiatric medications in some instances. I mean, if you're having problems and you take a med as like a young kid, and if that's not a part of a comprehensive plan where someone's helping you identify why you needed the med in the first place and helping you with that, that doesn't happen to a lot of people. A lot of times, you probably have a biological problem, or maybe it runs in your family. They get the med, they go back to their life. What an opportunity cost to take something that mutes your emotions and may not work long term, and you never get the ability to feel maybe things that you should be feeling because they're sending you signals that things aren't going well. And if you're feeling that, you may be more likely to act on them. And, you know, I worry about people who stay in abusive situations or bad jobs and things like that, because, you know, when that signals are going off telling them, yeah, be anxious, be depressed, they get shut down. That's another thing I don't think people talk about, is how how I actually think they can be detrimental to someone's development and emotional maturity by turning that off.
Well, yeah, they're going through puberty. You know, their hormones are changing, and you know, you've got these foreign agents in the body that are disrupting that process. Of course, it's going to have an effect. You know, you don't have to be a genius to work that one out, really, do you?
Yeah. Well, that's not what the people hear. Yeah, I feel like the people hear from the doctor, it's well tolerated, minor side effects.
Well, yeah, of course, you're going to believe the doctor.
You know, like, yeah, they get that. But I think what you said, Reese, is actually the most intuitive way. I think that's how naturally people would view this, coming into it with their own senses before they get almost, I think, taught to think in a different way.
Mm.